Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this timely session on cybersecurity, managing the breach. I am Babak Abbaszadeh, CEO of Toronto Centre, and your MC today. Toronto Centre was established in 1998 to promote financial stability and financial inclusion by building the capacity of financial sector regulators and supervisors in emerging markets and developing countries. We're proud to celebrate our 20th anniversary this year, and I'd also like to acknowledge our founders, a couple of our founders who are not involved here, the World Bank and the Schulich School of Business. Also recognize several people who teach at Toronto Centre programs and some who have been to our programs in the past. And also I should acknowledge a couple of our board members who are here today, Dr. Stefan Engves and Aditya Narain. So thank you all for being here. Financial services firms heavily rely on information technology. This exposes them to a growing and evolving set of cyber risks and crimes of all sorts, including large-scale theft of money and customer data and other unwelcome disruptions, which really erode confidence in financial stability. So naturally, cyber risk is a critical concern to governments, central banks, supervisory and regulatory authorities, financial services firms, and their clients. The changing nature of cyber risk is driven by the evolving use of technology by financial service providers, both incumbents and especially new fintech entrants, which has led to new and increased vulnerabilities. Therefore, international coordination is essential due to the cross-border nature of cyber attacks. Bodies such as the FSB, the Basel Committee, the G7 and G20, the IMF, the World Bank, the FSI, as well as Toronto Centre are all addressing this issue. We have assembled a very distinguished group of speakers for you. They will share their views on the challenges and what needs to be done to create cyber-resilient financial systems globally. I would like to thank our major funders, Global Affairs Canada, Swedish SIDA, and the IMF, for their continuous support of Toronto Centre and sponsoring this event. Without their ongoing support, we would not be able to bring you these programs or any of our more than 76 training programs for financial sectors, regulators and supervisors in more than 70 countries pretty much every year. At this time, I would like to introduce the two co-opening speakers one by one. And the number one in order of priority of the session, not priority, but anyway. Rob Stewart was appointed Associate Deputy Minister of Finance in October 2016. He's the Government of Canada's Finance Deputy for G7, G20, and for the Financial Stability Board. He provides leadership and policy advice to the government on a wide range of financial sector and international trade and finance matters. Before joining the Department of Finance, Rob worked at Export Development Canada and in the Canadian sports system. He holds a BA from Carleton University and an MBA from the University of Ottawa. Rob really has his finger on the pulse of Canadian and global financial public policy. He's a dedicated public servant, a real gentleman, and a great Canadian.
I am very appreciative of being asked to speak to you today, so thank you, Babak, very much for the invitation. Sorry to hold out on you for so long, but it's a busy time here in Washington. And it's true, I think that cybersecurity is an issue that's very, well, it's probably wrong to call it dear to my heart, but it's certainly probably very near the top of the list as far as many of us are concerned, really, because it's so unknowable. So let me start with a story. I was recently treated to a presentation from a guy named Professor Stephen Sloman, who's written a book called The Knowledge Illusion. He's a professor in the Cognitive Linguistic and Psych Sciences Department at Brown. And his essential point is we all think we know more than we do. And the reason we think we know more than we do is partly because our brains don't hold very much information, but because we're susceptible to the illusion of knowing more because we have access to knowledge. And that's fundamentally becoming more important as we enter the internet era, right, where the phones we carry around with us give us infinite access to knowledge. So we all think we know how things work. And the question that you need to ask people to show that they don't know what they're talking about is how does it work? And of course, it exposes the fact that they don't really know. But what also is true is that we live in a community of knowledge, and that's what keeps us working effectively together, is that everybody knows something and it all put together. But that community of knowledge is exposed to some pretty high uncertainties, and I think I'd put to you that cyber risk and cybersecurity is in that category. I mean, it's one of the most dangerous and unknowable risks we face. And there is an extremely high likelihood that we would overestimate our feelings and our understanding about our level of protection and preparedness to address it. So let me just focus for the sake of my remarks on the systemic cyber event, okay? So we'll set aside the one-offs, the SWIFT hack, or what Deutsche Bank apparently did a month ago, which was send more than their capital to the Deutsche Börse, or just by some fat finger or algorithmic accident. So let's set those aside and talk about something that's more malign, something that's criminally driven or state-sponsored. These things are unpredictable in their scale and impact. They're potentially huge in magnitude and hugely disruptive. And they could happen at any time, in any geography, and be instantly contagious to others. So it's really probably on the list of risks the financial system faces among the first, if not, solely the first risk. And it's a very important discussion to have about this, and I'm very grateful, and I think it's very appropriate that the Toronto Centre is putting it on today. So let me just do 2 or 3 quick things, frame for you a little bit what the G20 and the G7 are doing, and then finish with, sort of where I think we might want to go. So the G20 has been on to, cyber risk in a fairly big way in the recent past. Because of the conflicts that might exist with respect to perspectives on some elements with respect to cyber activity in the G20, they don't call it cybersecurity or cyber risk. They call it the malicious use of information and communication technologies, which is a nice euphemism, but it's the same thing. And last year, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors asked the FSB to do a stock take on the preparedness for cyber. And so they did and reported that out last fall. So if you can find it on the website of the FSB. The stock take of supervisory practices and guidance and regulations revealed that, as you might expect, there's not a lot of consistency out there in the world in terms of levels of preparedness, in terms of the nature of the regulations and of the supervisory guidance that's being provided. And it's obviously a worry. So they came out with some observations that came from a workshop they did with the private sector, which emphasized that, there's a need for principles-based, risk-based, and proportionate regulation, and to make sure, or to try to our best to harmonize and have a consistent approach across jurisdictions. So this seems quite self-evident. It's true in other respects than in cyber risk. But I think it also points to the need for collaboration beyond just the financial sector regulators, because, of course, when we talk about a systemic risk, it can affect many sectors, systemic sectors, transportation, telecoms, banking, as well as energy sector. So, there is a real need to collaborate in that fashion, and there's also a need to collaborate within governments across security and intelligence elements in government, as well as the regulatory parts of government. So that's where the FSB is. What they're doing right now is trying to put together a lexicon, which would make this dialogue and this discussion across financial services and entities across jurisdictions easier to have. The G7 started in 2016 to really get serious about that, and the Ishima Summit in Japan had a long declaration on principles and actions on cyber, which you can look up if you wish, but it emphasizes the same points that I'm making to you today, which is the need for maintaining interoperability and security, but at the same time taking decisive and robust measures to address the malicious use of cyberspace. And then not more recently, but since then, what has happened is there's a group called the Cyber Experts Group within G7, which is officials from various organizations, and they've published two things. One is the fundamental elements of cybersecurity in the financial sector, and the other is the fundamental elements of effective assessment of cybersecurity for the financial sector. And both of those are quasi-prescriptive guidance to all of us and all of the financial system regulators about how to prepare and improve readiness for a cyber event. They're currently looking at third-party risks, and they're looking at how to deal with threat-led penetration testing, and they're also looking at a bit at the issue of how to react, a protocol to react. So this is where I find it interesting, because I was a bit deceived by the title of this session, Babak. I have to say, I thought I was going to come and hear about the ex-post issues associated with cyber event, which is something that's of very grave interest to me, because I don't think we've focused on it enough. And I say that because last year, at about this time, maybe a month from now, I was in Bari, Italy, with the finance ministers and central bank governors, and if you recall, that was when the WannaCry virus happened, and we were in a fortress, stone walls, 10 feet thick, reading the FT and going, I wonder what this means for our financial sectors. And nobody really knew at that point. I mean, it was happening. It had happened. It was reported in the FT, but we didn't have any, communication. We had no sense of how badly this was spreading across sectors, the degree to which the financial sector was impaired. There was a real lack of awareness and understanding, and indeed a sense of what might need to be done. So this is what the Canadian G7 this year, as presidency, we're focusing on. We're calling it the day after. And we're going to have a session where we talk about what happens the day after. And for the purposes of that session, we've been doing a little workshopping ourselves. And what we've discerned is there are the usual set of issues that arise from a cyber event and the uncertainty that flows from that, the credit issues, the sense that people will pull back from dealing with counterparties, liquidity issues. But what there will also be is data integrity issues. And this is an issue we don't face in other risks, right? Where is the foundation? What is still reliable information, and how to restore it to make systems working? So we're, I think, going to have to grapple with, in dealing with a reaction to cyber risk, a different set of protocols and a different set of reactions. And that's something we're going to be talking about in the near future. So let me leave you with this. I don't know why it came to mind, but in the middle of the night last night, as I was lying awake thinking about what I'd say, I recalled I listened to a Massey lecture, one of these lectures that they put on in Canada, very, very good lectures, very eminent scholars, and it was about creation myths, indigenous creation myths, and the scholar who was speaking talked about a creation myth in which the world is on the back of a turtle. And the elder who was delivering this was asked, well, what's the turtle standing on? And he said, another turtle. And it's turtles all the way down. And this is not, all due respect to native creation myths, which I think is a lovely thing, this is not where we should be. Let's not be turtles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob, for such insightful comments, and I can assure you this is not a turtle group. But also the title, we haven't tried to in any way cage or confine the speakers to talk only about past, so I think you'll find that they won't disappoint. It's my pleasure now to invite to the podium our other co-opening speaker, whom I met for the first time earlier this year in Basel. Since January 2017, Mr. Adrian has held the position of Financial Counselor and Director of the Monetary and Capital Markets Department at the IMF. Before joining the IMF, he served as SVP and Associate Director of Research at Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where he helped lead financial stability and policy and monetary policy. So for those of you who know, New York Fed was really at the eye of the storm in the last crisis, trying to manage it as best as they could. Earlier, he conducted economic research at the U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research and at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. He has a PhD in economics from MIT and postgraduate degrees from the London School of Economics and Political Science and other prestigious European universities. He has taught economics at MIT, Princeton, and New York University. His economic analyses have been published in such scholarly journals as the American Economic Review, the Journal of Financial Economics, and the Journal of Finance. And since I met him before, I can testify that he's not only a gentleman, he's also a scholar. Thank you. Tobias.
Welcome to Washington and welcome to the International Monetary Fund. It's my pleasure to be here to open this event on cybersecurity. Our collaboration, and by our here I refer to the Monetary and Capital Markets Department of the IMF, or short MCM. MCM has collaborated with the Toronto Centre for 18 years and is valuing this relationship greatly. We're sharing common interest in financial stability topics and in technical assistance around the world. Cybersecurity in the financial sector is a huge issue. It's bigger than all of us, and we need to partner and collaborate across institutions and across countries around the world. So I really welcome this joint event with the Toronto Centre. And as I will give a little bit of an overview over the work that we are doing on cybersecurity at the fund and within MCM in particular. And you will see that we partner with many other institutions as well. So before giving you that overview, I just want to welcome one person on the podium, Stefan Ingves. Stefan actually had my job 20 years ago. He was the director of MCM at that time, and Stefan is known as the father of Basel III to many of you, but he's not only the father of Basel III, he's also the father of the Financial Sector Assessment Program. So these are the FSAPs, where we do surveillance in countries, very focused surveillance in countries around the world on a 5-year cycle typically, and assess financial stability. So welcome back, Stefan. It's great to have you here. So let me give you a little bit more detail on work on cybersecurity within MCM and across the fund. So when you look at surveys of risk managers around the world and you ask them, what is your number one risk that you worry about? So when you wake up in the middle of the night, what is it that you worry about? Cybersecurity always comes up on top, either first or second, right? That is the number one risk that risk managers are worrying about. And in the public sector, we are realizing more and more that this is an issue that we have to focus on, that this is a potential threat to financial stability. Technology is spreading around financial institutions, and cybersecurity risks are spreading very, very quickly, arguably exponentially. So ensuring cybersecurity is central to ensuring confidence and trust in the financial system. When we think about cybersecurity, we don't consider it an IT issue alone. Of course, there are IT aspects to cybersecurity, but we look at it as a governance problem. And the kind of work that we do around cybersecurity is really to think about a supervisory approach to how to deal with this issue. And so we think about machines and code and programs on the one hand, but we also spend a lot of time thinking about people. Because typically, cybersecurity breaches involve not just the code, but importantly involve the people who are using the machines. And typically, it's the intersection of the people who are using technology and the technology that is exploited. That was, for example, the case in the Bangladesh breach that was already mentioned. And this is what cyber criminals are trying to exploit all the time. It's the intersection of the human and the machine. So this is really where we have to focus our efforts on. Now, cybersecurity attacks are becoming more and more mature and more intense. An institution such as the International Monetary Fund is under constant attack. We have teams that spend all day defending the IMF. And I'm sure in many of your institutions, you're facing the same type of problem. And every bank and every major financial institution around the world is facing that. And as a result, in institutions such as the IMF, in private banks, in central banks, substantial resources are allocated to the problem of cybersecurity risks. An issue that we have started to focus on is that in many low-income countries and emerging market countries around the world, those resources are not available. And in many countries around the world, there are perhaps 1 or 2 or 3 or a handful of people that are thinking about these issues. But those countries and those institutions in those countries are just as vulnerable as institutions such as the IMF. As a result, MCM has started to develop a technical assistance program around cybersecurity. One of the triggers for that program was an event that took place in this room less than 6 months ago, and it was an event jointly sponsored jointly sponsored by the National Bank of Belgium. So Governor Smets, who is on the panel, greatly supported that event, and I would like to thank him here for that collaboration. So in this cybersecurity workshop, we brought 70 experts, IT, cybersecurity, and supervisory experts from around the world, from low-income countries, to the fund, into this room, to discuss issues of cybersecurity and to figure out steps that countries can take to make their financial system safer. This event was a watershed for everybody who was in the room. We had speakers who really explained to us how attacks are done, what is in the mind of the cyber criminals, how do cyber criminals go about attacks. We literally watched presentations of how you do a cyber attack, and it's worrisome because it's doable. If you know how to code and if you have a vicious mind, you can start to attack institutions, and attacks are getting ever more sophisticated, and the threats are growing. So during this event, the sensitivities for cyber security risks have greatly been enhanced, and the depth of our understanding has been furthered. And we will do another event like that in a year or so from now, where we asked participants to go back to their home institutions and work on the cybersecurity issues, and to then come back here and report back on their progress, but also the institutional hurdles. Because of course, oftentimes, cybersecurity is not necessarily discussed at the highest level of a central bank or of a regulatory agency. So getting traction within the official sector is very important. We don't want to have to work to be attacked to actually become aware of the risks of cybersecurity breaches. We have started to run a program around technical assistance centers around the world on cybersecurity, and we have done a number of bilateral missions to countries to work on specific issues. We're working on that with other departments around the fund. For example, one of our missions was done jointly with our IT department. So our experts that are protecting the IMF went along with our financial sector experts to a country to help that country make their IT system safer. We are also working with SPR, the strategy department of the IMF. SPR has taken the lead in quantifying the macro criticality of cybersecurity risks. So they basically look at the data of cyber attacks, how many attacks occur, and how big the losses are, and they calculate, what is the likelihood to have a really macro-critical event. And I can tell you that it is just a matter of time until we see such a macro-critical event somewhere in the world. We are also working with our legal department because, of course, cybersecurity attacks have many legal aspects. Now, in terms of thinking through our approaches to cybersecurity risks, we are taking a three-pronged approach. One leg of that approach is to develop a mapping of cybersecurity threats. And we overlay the map of the IT system and the map of the vulnerabilities in the IT system with a map of the financial sector. So basically, over the past decade, there has been a lot of work about the interlinkages of financial sector exposures. And cybersecurity risks, of course, are also interconnected. And so we overlay the interconnectedness in the IT system with the interconnectedness of the financial system to jointly get at amplification mechanisms in the intersection of IT and financial systems. So this is work in progress. Of course, it's very ambitious because the data needs to do this are enormous. And we are mapping out how to do this, and it's ultimately up to national authorities to really implement that. In Canada, you could actually put together the data on the IT infrastructure, think about the potential spillovers of the IT infrastructure and how that relates to spillovers across financial institutions. I think this is a way to really get at the systemic risk in this area. Secondly, we are thinking about crisis management problems, right? We have done a lot of work on restructuring of banks, on resolution of banks that are hit by liquidity problems and solvency problems. But we are only at the beginning of understanding how to restructure or unwind institutions that are brought down by cyber attacks. There are many new issues to think through, and we're only starting to really get our heads around those issues. A third area of our work is on stress testing. Of course, you also want to ask ex ante, if there is an attack, what does that mean for the resilience of the financial institution? Can we build cybersecurity scenarios into our stress tests, the stress tests that are run regularly in things like the FSAPs and that are done by national authorities in regular intervals? With that, I'm gonna pass it back to the panel. I think this area is very scary. Once you start thinking about these threats and imagine what could happen, it becomes very quickly very scary. On the other hand, it's also a very interesting area. There are many new issues to think through. There are new tools to build. There are new regulatory and supervisory issues to think about. And so I think the panel that is coming next is going to be extremely interesting. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Tobias and Rob. That was a very good presentation. So now you have an overview about the G20, G7, and the IMF, what they're doing. I like the image of the the person and the machine, the cyborgs that we're all trying to deal with. At this point, I'd like to now pass it to the panel. I won't be able to introduce every one of them. They're very distinguished. You have received their bios ahead of time. The bios are on your chairs. They're well known. If I was going to read them, you'll see me and less of them. So I'm just going to try to avoid that. But I'm going to introduce our moderator very briefly. Aditya Narain is the Deputy Director of IMF's MCM department with responsibilities for its work on financial supervision and regulation, as well as its technical assistance program. He represents MCM on the Basel Committee and leads FSAP missions, most recently the ones in Canada and the US. He's a former senior official at the Reserve Bank of India. He's also, as I mentioned earlier, board member of the Toronto Centre, and we're very happy to have him. And I have to say, I'm also very glad that one of Aditya's part-time pursuits is to be a moderator at Toronto Centre events here at IMF World Bank. I think this must be about your third one now. Okay, Aditya, I pass it to you for the panel and also for the closing wrap-up. Thank you.
Thank you, Babak, for that introduction, and I'm also very grateful to both Rob and Toby for helping frame the discussions and reminding us of the priorities that this issue really needs, the attention that this issue needs. I'm going to dive straight into the discussion. So let me start with Stefan. Tobias mentioned one of your hats, which was 20 years ago. Now you wear two of them, both as the governor of the Central Bank of Sweden, as well as the chair of the Basel Committee. And as you know, there's an almost constant and continuous exhortation of the regulatory committee to balance innovation and regulation in a meaningful fashion. This is something clearly which is topmost on your mind, particularly given that Sweden is on the forefront of financial innovation in many ways. It's the most cashless society, if that's correct. Yes, the cash least society, it's considered. There's a lot of digital innovation which is ongoing. And so how do you, in both the roles that you have, balance this, to strive to balance between this innovation and regulation in your policy work?
Well, I would say that it's not, of course, not easy, but at the same time, it's pointless to turn back time. So you just have to embrace new technologies in one way or the other. And let me just say a few things about it, wearing my Basel Committee hat, how the committee tries to grapple with this. And it's really grappling with the issue because most of us don't come from the IT side. So we sort of struggle with topics and issues and words and names of things that we're not from the beginning trained to deal with. So a few key points on this. First of all, I think it's clear that fintech, or whatever we call it, holds a lot of potential. Because it basically lowers the cost of transactions in the financial sector, and it increases the choice that you can give consumers of financial services. And that is important when it comes to, let's say, financial inclusion, because it's just simply easier to bring more people into the financial sector, and that's a good thing in itself. Probably also lowers the average cost of transaction in one way or the other, and that's also a good thing. But then, having said that, it should be done so that it's not done at the expense of safety and soundness. And that's where it gets difficult, and that's where it gets hard. But regardless of what we call things, supervisors and banks and bankers themselves are still responsible for supervising, and bankers are responsible for what they are doing, regardless of whether we have financial innovation or not. And that does not really go away. And that's really the role of the Basel Committee and supervisors to deal with this. Now, having said that, given that this is on the agenda in many parts of the world and among many institutions, in order not to have people doing the same thing everywhere, it's important for the Basel Committee and many others to make sure that there is enough interaction so that various bodies are actually talking about these things with each other when it comes to what they're doing. Second point, it's not that financial innovation sort of showed up the day before yesterday. I mean, it's been around for a long time. And my institution has been around for 350 years this year. And I mean, 350 years ago, people were running around with copper coins that weighed about 40 pounds apiece. So in that sense, clearly, innovation is a good thing because we don't have to do that today anymore. And think about ATMs. I mean, we take them for granted today, but they aren't that old. Electronic payments, internet banking, All of this is sort of something that makes it easier to transact. What is happening now, though, which is new, is quite a generational thing, and that is that old people prefer notes and coins and to do things on paper. Young people don't prefer notes and coins at all. They just do it over their cell phones and computers. And that means that there is quite a generational difference here. So in some parts of the world, it's very easy to embrace new technologies, just run with it. And maybe sometimes too fast because you aren't fully sure that this is safe and sound. And in other parts of the world, it takes a bit longer. Third issue here is that many of these things are cross-sectoral, which Tobias already pointed out, and many of them are also actually in one form cross-border. And both those issues are actually quite important because that, of course, makes it more complicated when people need to figure out what is going on and they have to talk to each other about what is going on. And that will require actually probably over time more standardization and more coordination. And both of those issues actually take time because then people have to talk to each other. And you have to share information. And immediately when you get into sharing information cross-border, it gets incredibly complicated because you have confidentiality laws and requirements that differ between countries. All in all, this is also going to increase competition so that we get a bunch of new players. And that, of course, also raises all these issues that we've heard about earlier this morning about cyber risk. I think that sort of a stark way of putting it is to say the following, that it gets harder and harder to answer the question, where is my money? We tend to think about it in terms of cash. Then we sort of say, well, it's on a hard drive someplace. But that's not the case anymore either, because nowadays you can have hard drives globally, all over the world. And if one of them goes down, my money moves to another hard drive in another corner of the world. And weren't really prepared to answer those questions fully as of yet in order to sort of deal with them. And then coming from the central banking side, defending what I do, there's all this crypto, this, that, and the other. But I'm still of the view that central bank money is better than crypto, this and that. Because crypto assets, as I prefer to call them, is sort of like trading stamps or tulip bulbs and other things like that. And experience tells us that what goes up usually comes down. So in that sense, I still feel that the central bank run payment systems, that's a safer bet.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for reminding us about the reliability of banks as probably being the one great factor which is going to probably ensure their continuation. The issue of trust, which was implicit in your remarks. But I also like the fact that you reminded us that the intergenerational difference between today's young and old, and I wonder what today's young will do when they are old. But that's a question for later. So I'm going to move now to our next panelists, and I'm going to move to Carolyn. Carolyn, you're the Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. You are well known to insiders as one of the lead authors of the report which the FSB prepared on fintech, which rated cyber risks as one of the key risks, one of the 3 priorities that needed to be addressed. And of course, the Bank of Canada has identified cyber risk as one of the key risks to financial stability. Businesses, as Tobias reminded us, already rank it as one of the highest risks that they face. So can you share your experiences of what the Bank of Canada is doing in this regard, given that you are working on these topics and are concerned about them as well?
Sure. I mean, clearly it's the top of everybody's mind, so the fact that it's one of the things that keeps us up at night is not unique. What is unique, though, when you're a central bank is the fact that you're not only worried about the risk on your own behalf, but you're worried about the risk to those institutions that you oversee. So in the Bank of Canada's point of view, it's financial market infrastructure, core to the financial system, as well as the financial sector at large. And so what that means is that we've kind of got 2 tracks in the work that we do. One is keeping our own house in order and showing leadership in that regard. And the other one is the work that we do with industry to ensure that the right amount of prevention and recovery is there. With respect to our own work within the Bank of Canada, clearly we're doing what a lot of institutions are doing, is looking at their own prevention aspects, so identification, having second data sites, all the kind of mechanical things you would expect. But I would say that the one area that we need to focus on a lot in every institution, aside from those very tangible actions, are the intangible ones with respect to risk culture. Because even a major event, when you think of where it can come from the outside, but it can also come from the inside. Not even because of malicious activity or intent. It could be just somebody just not understanding what they're doing. And so that's a big part of the work that we're doing. But I was completely on Rob's page at the beginning when he talked about recovery. And that work not only extends from what we're doing at the bank, but also what we're doing with other institutions. And I'd like to talk a bit about that because it is a cultural change and in many, many ways about how about we think of things. Because if you're a cybersecurity person, you're saying, not on my watch. This is never going to happen on my watch. Okay, that's what you want. Except for we know that the best way to manage those risks is to say, let's behave as if, or get ready as if it actually will happen. And that's a hard thing for any individual institution to do. But it's even harder, in a sense, to do that with a group of institutions who are used to competing with each other as opposed to collaborating. And so from an oversight perspective, we work with Payments Canada, who runs our large value transfer system and our largest retail payment system, and we work on exercises. So we have different scenarios that are cyber events of varying degrees, that the kinds you would expect. Data theft, data integrity, or corruption issues, as well as shutdown of operations or disruptions of operations which are significant enough. And through those exercises, whether they're tabletops, full-out simulations, or day-after exercises, it's really the best way to kind of, as you're doing it, figure out where there are holes in your recovery plans and your collective recovery plans, because anybody in the room who's done one of these knows that very quickly you can't, in a serious cyber event, you can't do it on your own. And so that's a big chunk of the work that we've been engaged in over the last couple of years and will continue to be engaged in. And the challenges that you face are interesting. Obviously, information sharing is one of them, even within any jurisdictions. There's legal issues that maybe get in the way, but there's also competitive issues or reputational issues that people are worried about. But aside from that, it's the sheer number of players that are relevant. And so we talked, Tobias talked about the fact that we're dealing with financial sector players. But depending on the event, in fact, that's not the only set of players you need in the room, because say if it was an event affecting electricity grids or the telecommunications grids, you know that those are outside the regular circle of financial sector participants. And on top of that, there's contention for recovery of those resources from hospitals and police services and other services. And so that's where coordination at the government level is just essential. And one of the things that Canada has just done in the budget was to have a Canadian cyber initiative, which provides a single point of contact. And lots of details to work out, but I think that's something outside what central banks can do, but it's something that would really help central banks and other authorities actually do their jobs. So I think the Bank of Canada's approach has been to engage, not to try to boil the ocean. It can feel like that. If anybody's been working on these plans, we make a plan that's imperfect, and then we work to improve it over time. And then we work collaboratively with the government and others in the international community to make the plans the best we can.
Thank you, Karen. I think the idea of a single point of contact, given the fact that you have an Internet of Things out there, not just the financial system, probably is a very useful takeaway for all of us. So I'll move now to Governor Smets. Jan, you are in charge of overseeing some of the most critical financial infrastructure, including SWIFT and Euroclear. The National Bank of Belgium has clearly been doing a lot of thinking about issues related to cyber risk and cyber resilience. Could you walk us through an example, a practical example of how do you approach this, and what is the advice that you would give to people on the approach that they should take?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. We are looking at this, the National Bank of Belgium, in a double capacity. Evidently as a macroprudential supervisor, but also in a capacity of macroprudential authority. It's now for a number of years that in the Financial Stability Review we publish every year, we put cybersecurity on an equal footing as other financial stability risks like real estate or low interest rates for long and so forth. And it's absolutely true that this is no longer a simple IT problem, knowing that the digital is advancing, that IT systems are complex, that there is a huge interconnectedness, that there is also many outsourcing in this world. And knowing that we are not talking only about IT, but about things like identity theft and data compromise and loss of access, this clearly has a financial stability, systemic dimension. Now, that being said, how do we supervise? And then I come to a concrete example. Just the three dimensions of our supervision, I would say, would be first, keeping awareness. We try to make sure to be and to remain aware of all important evolutions in cyber and getting to know and to follow this map of threats Tobias was referring to, contacts with other supervisors, financial industry, IT service providers. So we are contributing and we are discussing a lot. Secondly, a second dimension is to formulate very precise, very concrete expectations to the financial industry. For instance, we have been publishing a circular for our systemic institutions with very clear and precise prudential expectations on operational continuity and security of these institutions. And evidently, this is being complemented with policy-making activities at the European and international level. And then thirdly, when it comes to supervision, you have evidently you have the capital requirements associated with op risk that will going to change thanks to Stefan in Basel 3.5. But in addition, you have the monitoring of the operational security, arriving at a risk profile per institution, follow-up of governance, risk management, controls, defensive capabilities. And we're doing that through on-site inspections, where the creation of the SSM has helped us for large groups to do that in a more standardized and coordinated way. And we do a lot of off-site supervision activities, workshops, remediation of cyber incidents, and so forth. Now, this is, let's say, the structure. When you would ask me how we as a central bank are assisting, or an example of how we are assisting financial institutions, also market infrastructures, when preparing for a eventual breach and managing the breach, this is the title of this session. Well, I should refer to a decision we have been taken just a few weeks ago, namely to establish a framework we call it TIBER-B, so threat intelligence-based ethical red teaming. So we decided, along with, or following the example of the Bank of England, of the UK, and the Netherlands, we decided on a local implementation of the overarching TIBER European framework developed by the European Central Bank in order to provide, let's say, the financial system with a framework where they can see whether they timely detect intrusions and have the capacity to respond to incidents in an adequate way. So we will play a coordinating role. This is not about oversight or macroprudential supervision. It's more, let's say, a role as catalyst, setting the framework wide. We will play a coordinating role, act as a test manager, guiding financial institutions with this ethical hacking tests, red team tests, through the entire testing process. And we will seek to continuously improve the framework based on the lessons and the outcomes of prior tests. So these red teams will simulate a real attack, therefore stress institutions' capabilities, as I said, to detect and respond. And in order to render these exercises as realistic and challenging as possible, we will seek to liaise with commercial and state-led intelligence services. Advanced threat intelligence will allow ethical hackers to apply specific attack patterns and techniques that are, let's say, the most relevant for the institution that is being tested, taking into account its threat profile. That's a way we think we can contribute very actively to strengthen resilience in a tailored framework, maintaining, let's say, also our preparedness, and also keeping control over the process, because we would decide on the sequence of who would have to be submitted to these tests.
Thank you, Governor. I mean, I really like the part when you talked about your role as a catalyst when working with the financial institutions, and I think that's a very interesting role to play in this discussion. So let me now move to our last panelist, and Javier, as this UK and US CEO of SWIFT, you are responsible for a very important part of the financial ecosystem. And so how is it that you sleep well at night? What are you doing to make sure that the cyber resilience of this ecosystem is maintained and strengthened?
Yeah. Well, I try to sleep at night, yes. We'll get into that maybe later. Actually, well, let's refer, because I think it has been indirectly referred to. I mean, obviously what the SWIFT ecosystem had to go through over the past couple of years on the back of highly publicized cases that everybody is familiar with. I think it's good to take a step back and see what was a little bit the standard modus operandi, because we've seen a pretty common approach to how the ecosystems, whether it is in this case the SWIFT ecosystem or many others, using different kind of technologies or either other infrastructures, have been actually compromised. And the way they've gone about it, cyber criminals have gone about it, is by starting, not by trying to crack the infrastructure in the middle, which tends to be in general robust. In the case of SWIFT, obviously, we are overseen by the G20 and the NBB as a lead overseer. That's probably the most critical aspect, is to maintain our systems with the highest level of resilience, availability, and confidentiality. So cyber criminals, they have not necessarily gone against the center of the infrastructure. They've tried to compromise one of the endpoints in the network. In our case, obviously, we are an 11,000 users network present in more than 200 countries. And the way they did the first compromise, highly publicized compromise, and many others, is by actually compromising the bank through traditional methods, phishing attacks, entering potentially through a lower protected area from the bank, and then move laterally and compromise access the critical systems. Critical systems, obviously, in a bank, the SWIFT server is a critical one. And by having access to this to the SWIFT server of the bank, they managed to steal credentials, valid operator credentials, and through malware, introduce fraudulent transactions that look legitimate. And how they managed to do so is by removing all the traces of their attacks. Traces being, if you're interested and you've read it, obviously, is all the statements coming back, the acknowledgements, and so forth. Even adjusting balances in the statements that the banks have sent and received. So very sophisticated, but very common as well in terms of modus operandi. So the way we responded together with the rest of the community is by introducing what we call a customer security program that goes beyond the securing of the infrastructure, is making sure that we have a new common security controls framework that raises the bar in security across the whole ecosystem. So there are a series of controls, 16 mandatory controls, 11 advisory, that the whole SWIFT ecosystem needs to comply with. And the way they've done that is by self-attesting their compliance with these controls and making these available for counterparts that may want to have access to it to include that as a data set in their own risk frameworks. So that is, and maybe I should say, particularly in this kind of event, I would thank many of you, definitely my co-panelists, but many of you in the different jurisdictions, because the way you've been also supporting that message has helped us now reach 93% of our community that has self-attested. That represents 99% of the SWIFT volumes. So it is significant, just in a bit less than a year. And that already is, I mean, because we know there are many projects behind all of these banks trying to reach this level of security. So that's point one of the program. But that's not only, that is not the only part of the program, because, and it was mentioned by actually most of you, we need to assume in cyber, unfortunately, that the worst can happen. And the worst is, yes, that you are still compromised, even if you have the right security controls. And even more common, that one of your counterparts is compromised. Because it was mentioned, that is the trick, the tricky part of securing a cross-border ecosystem. It's not just around your own jurisdiction, it goes beyond that. So you need to assume that one of your counterparts is compromised, and that is where fraud detection and prevention comes into play. And yes, Stefan mentioned innovation. Innovation can also play a positive role there, because by leveraging new technologies such as AI, machine learning, deception technologies, you have a growing number of fintechs that are actually very much active into this field and helping banks in their efforts around fraud detection, prevention, and also, Caroline mentioned, remediation, testing, and so forth to help in the recovery plans. So that's point two. We're also helping there, for example, by, of course, the data that is exchanged through the SWIFT network, highly secured, and by protecting and by providing data privacy policies, we can provide access to the golden copy that is exchanged through the SWIFT network to our customers as a reconciliation mechanism. So end of day, for example, ex post, they can receive that golden copy of all the transactions that are stored in the SWIFT network and reconcile with what they have on-premise. And if there's been a compromise or data has been tampered with, they can detect fraud and access the payment and either recall it or stop it. Another one is that now, increasingly more, we've seen that most of the attacks, again, not all, but most of them, have been off hours or during a holiday, weekend. So you could define at the level of the network some static criteria on thresholds or, as I said, off hours, or for particular counterparts, for payments that meet in these criteria to be stopped or delivered, but are generated for the community to act on it. So a lot of innovation happening in the field of fraud detection and prevention. And maybe I should end with the last part, and it was, I think, mentioned by everybody, collaboration is key. And the last part of the program is the whole information sharing. Because there is in a recent report, actually it could be read that I think there are 100 million new pieces of malware yearly. So that brings it home around the sophistication of the attacks keep evolving. Cyber criminals keep getting more sophisticated. So therefore, that's where information sharing around malware, modus operandi, indicator of compromise is key. We have the whole community having access to our SWIFT Exact platform now and being able to protect themselves in a completely different manner.
Thank you, Javier. And I think you reminded us of something very important, that criminals work weekends and after hours. And it's something to be really kept in mind. Stefan, I know it's never a good idea to try and pin down your boss, but I'm going to try anyway. Okay. So I have a two-part question for you. One is about the Riksbank itself. What efforts or what's going on in the Riksbank in terms of developing your approach towards managing and mitigating cyber risk and managing the breach. And probably a more important question which people have asked often, what is the Basel Committee doing about it in terms of when should we expect to hear or see something more in terms of guidance on this issue?
Let me start then with the Riksbank part of it, and I don't think it's all that dissimilar compared to what other central banks do. You talk to the banks, you practice, and you try to run different types of scenarios, and you just see what happens if the whole... I'm talking now about this very much from a payment system perspective, because all large banks, most small banks are hooked up to the payment system in one way or the other, and if you can't run the payment system, basically the country stops very, very soon. So, and the ultimate kind of exercise is basically to do everything, try to do everything by hand. And we have enough old people around who actually remember what it was like to do everything by hand when everything has stopped. So once in a while we actually ask people to come to the bank and run it that way. It's kind of slow, but still it's good to maintain that type of knowledge. But things have changed over time when it comes to what we do and how we do it, because some years ago we concluded that we just had to outsource all our IT activities to others, because there was no way in the world that we could sort of maintain the knowledge that you would need to have in order to be really good at it. But that, of course, then raises a whole bunch of other issues, because then you need to understand what you're buying when you have outsourced it. So that's an issue. I think that it's exactly right on what we heard from both Jan and Caroline when you talked about the central bank being a catalyst. And the catalyst part that's there because competitors don't like to talk to each other. And competitors find it incredibly difficult to talk to competitors about things that went wrong in your own institution. I mean, that's a tough thing to do, to call up your competitors and say, I think you should know, don't do this or don't do that. We did it and it didn't work at all. I mean, so it comes very natural for people to turn to the central bank, and you end up being kind of like a neutral exchange of information, which makes it easier for everybody. Even if you don't decide things, just being in the room, bringing people into the same room, forcing them, having them to talk to each other is actually quite helpful. Then to the work of the Basel Committee, I mean, the Basel Committee, like any other international body, is looking into this, and like any other international body, we have also set up a working group thinking about this. Having said that, that's easy to say, but the hard part is really when you design a working group to deal with these issues, what is it that these people are actually supposed to do? Because it's one thing for supervisors to talk about these things together with supervisors. It's a completely different thing to talk to rocket scientists and technicians. And there you need to bridge that gap to make sense of it all. And in order to avoid double work, it's very important at the global level to coordinate properly and not do duplicative work, which highly likely actually from time to time is going to end up being contradictory, because you never know from the beginning where you will end up. Now, the Basel Committee has produced general principles dealing with these issues, and those principles are more about the governance structure you need than about technology as such. And those principles deal, for example, with issues like board and management oversight, security controls, legal and reputational risk management, managing outsourced activities, authorization and audit trail practices, consumer privacy, business continuity, and contingency planning practices. Those are sort of fairly general, so the committee can produce fairly general statements about what you should be mindful of in this field. Then it's a completely different thing when you actually have to produce these things within individual financial institutions. And that's more for supervisors and technicians to sort of look into the technical details of this, but kind of under this type of umbrella that the Basel Committee has has produced. Let me also in this field mention one project which is managed by the Financial Stability Board, which I actually think will be very important. It sounds sort of trivial, but it is not. And that's the project, the FSB project producing a cyber lexicon. Somebody told me that they were supposed to produce, I'm probably exaggerating now a bit, like 50,000 definitions, and it would take them 5 years. I think they eventually settled on like 10,000 in 5 months. So we will see what will come out of that. But this is much, much more important than most people realize, because in many cases, it's not clear what we are talking about when we talk about cyber, this, that, and the other, or IT issues of different types. So it probably will be quite helpful at the global level to have a kind of a sort of agreed lexicon, because that will make it easier to carry out these conversations that, given where the world is moving, will have to go on probably forever.
Thank you, Stefan. I think you raised a very important issue about contingency planning by having some kind of manual backup exercises, and it'll be useful later to get some idea of whether people are actually able to go back in time to when they had to work with their hands and write with their pens. So we'll come to that. And I think you also made another very important point about the central bank's role as that of an agony aunt who can listen to everybody's complaints whom they would not want to share with each other or their losses. So, and now my next question is to Carolyn. So you talked a little bit about this in terms of the single point of contact across, as a focal point for enhancing communication and across agencies, across other interests. So what can regulators and supervisors do to improve cybersecurity regulations and cooperation in this field?
Well, I think we have the international bodies that are there that can do it. The Basel Committee, Stefan, you're talking about the great work that's being done there and in the Financial Stability Board. I would say coming out of the fintech work that I led, that led to a report last year, we really elevated a couple of issues that spoke to cyber specifically. And it's an interesting thing because it's not a one-sided coin when it comes to fintech in general or digitalization, because as been mentioned, there are lots of opportunities to actually improve risk profile when it comes to cyber with technological improvements, given the starting point of legacy systems that are often siloed. And that being said, there are also new sorts of risks. And I think there's 3 areas that really preoccupied me and the people on the group that I led in the discussions. And the first one is really related to third-party service providers in areas that are highly concentrated. And so an example of that would be cloud services or data provision services where every institution, including central banks, are probably using one of the few that are out there. These institutions may have every incentive to manage their own cyber risk, but at the same time, they're not going to take into account the negative externalities, the fact that they're big or too big to fail in some sense. And it does, when you look at that, kind of raise the question about the organizing framework that we have already for managing third-party risks. And it's a little bit provocative, but typically, say under Basel, some of the aspects, it's really well managed for a certain type or a certain size of risk, where the banks are required in their contracts to have requirements. That's one way of dealing with it. And so it's kind of up to the banks, as you said, to manage their own risk and monitor it and do their own due diligence. And it's always the best place to start because it gets the incentives right. At the same time, we recognize in other areas of the system, like with SWIFT, for example, that's a global system. And instead, we have an oversight body that's led by Belgium that involves a number of central banks. So you kind of have 2 extremes. And in my mind, this warrants a review and a look at it and say, okay, for major providers, do we think the model that we have right now is sufficient? in all areas? And the answer may be probably in most areas, but not everywhere. And so there are some private sector providers that have popped up. There's a Know Your Third-Party service that's a private sector service that does due diligence for institutions. It's interesting. Kind of looks like a credit rating agency. So again, do you want that to run on its own, or do you want some guardrails around that? Very important questions in my mind that are systemic of importance. I think the second area is just to recognize that in a distributed ledger kind of crypto world, there's a lot that could be said, I suppose, if the technology stands the test of time, that distribution actually helps cyber risk in some sense, at least not worrying about a single point of truth that could be corrupted. At the same time, we also know that these assets are transacted through centralized exchanges, which in fact provide a very unique opportunity for hackers to do what hackers do. And we've seen that with Mt. Gox. So that's another area that I think as we look to crypto assets and defining what they are and figuring out how to get our arms around that ecosystem from a regulatory point of view, that's another area. And the final one that I mentioned is that we have this view which I've long held that what you do from a regulatory point of view should be proportional to the risk. And when you think about cyber, we have an example in Canada where we're trying to increase access to the payment systems, okay? And then you think, well, what are the criteria? Well, there may be some risks that in fact shouldn't be proportional because they're weakest link risks. And so in fact, it should be same activity, same regulation when it comes to cyber if you want access to core systems. And I think the SWIFT example is a good example of the points of entry may be quite far from the core, but in fact, they're important too. And so those are the three areas. I think internationally, it just makes sense from an efficiency point of view, if nothing else, for global authorities to work on it together. And not only that, but authorities across the standard setting bodies who are dealing with the same issues to do it together.
Thank you. So you told us that we've got to figure out ways of supervising the cloud. In one sense, how we should use technology to turn the tables, in a sense, on cyber criminals. And you use the P word, proportionality, which I think is very much in our discussions these days. So turning to you, Jan, again, I know I'm kind of sticking to the same theme, but what is it that you think NBB should do more of or is already doing, or tell us what they're already doing in terms of enhancing this cooperation across sectors nationally as well as internationally?
Yeah, well, internationally, as I mentioned before, we are very well integrated in the whole international supervisory and financial stability world, and we try to align with this. On the national, in the national framework, we do set up cooperation in 3 dimensions or in 3 pillars. One which is making the link with, let's say, the financial industry. One which is making the link with all other infrastructures, critical infrastructures. And one, I would say, which is making the link perhaps with society. The one which is, the first pillar is the cooperation with the banking system. We have this back from 2007. In the first years, it was about the fight against e-banking fraud, but now it has broadened up and widened to all forms of cybersecurity hacking. So there's a cooperation which is very successful, where people meet, share experiences, know-how. People get to know each other, trust also each other. And that's, according to our experience, something which is very useful in terms of exchange of information and best practices, but also in telling or informing general public. There was a website with videos, with messages to raise awareness vis-à-vis, let's say, the client. The second pillar for cooperation is the one with critical infrastructure. We are, by law, responsible for the protection of critical infrastructures and institutions in the Belgian financial sector. But there is a law which is, let's say, providing the framework for monitoring all critical infrastructures on the government's level. And that is about transport, about energy, about communication, and so on. And we, by that law, have had the assignment to lead and to coordinate the information exchange between all these critical infrastructures and institutions for all cyber incidents with a significant impact. So what does that mean? Every incident has to be informed. If it is relevant for, let's say, the sector, there is an information, a communication, anonymous most of the time, about what people should look at. There may be agreements on how to communicate to the public or to the economy in case of severe incidents. And we organize yearly crisis incident response tests with all these infrastructures and institutions. And we are also in contact as far as that is concerned with the crisis center of the government. And then the third pillar is a recent one. Our Minister of Finance a few years ago launched an initiative about, let's say, the future of our financial sector. And one of the initiatives which came from it was the establishment of what we call a Belgian Financial Sector Cyber Advisory Council, focusing more on the strategic aspects, but also, for instance, legal impediments for the fight against cybercrime. For instance, limitation on information exchange about fraudsters and imposed by the privacy legislation, because that's a big issue. A framework to encourage the responsible disclosure of security vulnerabilities by third parties. And that's a council which, so we are meeting with the Minister of Finance, the Belgian Center for Cybersecurity, the insurance, the banking associations, also the critical infrastructure. And it's also a council which is advising the government for awareness campaigns and for cyber education initiatives in schools and universities, because, as Tobias rightly said, there is a very important human factor in all this issue, both in terms of awareness and both in terms of finding the people, the expertise and the market to do the job. And that is more and more challenging.
Thank you. I think you laid out a very useful formulation of your three-tier system: the financial industry, the critical infrastructure, and society. And the point which you made about communication, I thought was very important. In the case of an event, how would you manage the kind of communication which is needed? So let me come to my final question. I still hope we will have time for some question and answers from the audience as well. And this is for Javier. SWIFT is run by the financial institutions. It's owned by the financial institutions. You interact with the industry on an almost daily basis. You heard the view of the official sector here. What's the industry up to?
Well, I think if you, maybe I can refer to the opening remarks of Stefan on because you summarized it pretty well. I think there are two main events that are impacting the industry right now, and they are actually converging. On the one hand, you have this unprecedented amount of innovation, and maybe I can cover it in a minute, that is opening up huge amount of opportunities across the financial industry, across the end-to-end value chain. But on the other hand, cyber and I would say as well financial crime compliance, sanctions, KYC, and AML are keeping the industry's feet firmly on the ground. So you have, and these two elements need to be managed appropriately to capture the opportunities while making sure that you maintain stability and security of the system. So, and maybe so if I elaborate a bit on both. The first one, obviously we all know the context. There's talk now more than talk about the fourth industrial revolution, which is an industrial interplay of technology, not just mobile and cloud anymore, but also sensors, robotics, big data, DLT, artificial intelligence, just to name a few. And this is already having an impact in the financial industry. Actually, businesses expect from the financial industry the same kind of experience, choice, service integration that they get in their daily lives from the so-called GAFA, the famous Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. And what we're seeing is that the traditional transaction banking model is being transformed because there is a series of new entrants, fintechs, that are, by the way, that are powered by pro-competition regulations. For example, in Europe, PSD2, leveraging APIs on the back of open banking. And basically, this is salami slicing, almost, the traditional payments value chain. And of course, and it was referred to earlier, while banks keep on rolling out digital services, there is a growing number of entry points through which cyber criminals can access systems and customer data. So that's why probably the digital age is more than ever the age of risk management. And I think the way the industry is going about it is by embedding cyber and financial crime compliance into the way they do innovation, increasingly more. It's not after the fact, but just designing cyber from the outset when you come up with new products and services. It's a bit like, if I can take an analogy that I think it's very commonly used now in this kind of sessions, is that the brakes that were introduced in cars were not introduced to make the cars go slower, but they were introduced to make the cars go faster. And it's a bit that what the industry is getting its grips around, is making sure that while we introduce all these new entrants, these new fintechs, all these new platforms that are intermediating between banks and their customers, we maintain the highest levels of security and compliance.
Thank you for ending this conversation with a look at the future, because as you mentioned, the financial landscape is changing and changing rapidly. You talked about the GAFA, the dividing line between e-commerce and finance is now slowly going away. And how do we deal with the new issues which these are raising, including for cyber risk? I think we have time for a few questions. There are some mics. So 1, 2, we'll take 3 questions. There are some mics around. They're coming to you. Please let us know. The gentleman here. Please identify yourself, because in a discussion on cyber risk, we cannot do with anonymity.
Hi, I'm Bikramjeet Singh. I'm a fellow with New Rules for Global Finance. Working with an FI myself in Canada. I'm sure you're aware of the recent Equifax breach. And some of the FIs in Canada just responded with moving their primary provider to another entity. Thoughts on if that's enough of a response from FIs, and any other comments? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's take the other question as well. Yes, the lady there, and then one here.
I'm Fredes Montes from the World Bank, working on financial infrastructure. My question is to maybe all the panelists. Like, you discussed the exchange of information. If you could clarify to us a little bit more, when do we have to exchange information and within the additional authorities, and what level do we exchange information with the law enforcement agencies? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. The third question here, and then we can.
Pentti Hakkarainen, ECB. Are panel members concerned of the fact that authorities have less and less control on technological advancement, and it is more and more outside our perimeter?
Thank you. So maybe we can, Caroline, would you like to start? And then we can go.
Sure. I wasn't counting on that, but that's very clever. Equifax, I'm not going to comment on a specific action by a bank, but I think the interesting thing about cyber breaches like that is it does indicate that important companies that are outside the regulatory span, can cause issues for institutions in the core of the system, which is what I was saying about third-party service providers and thinking about, are the safeguards that we already have in place sufficient and what went wrong? And it's not because something happened. There's an indication. I mean, you can't ever drive risk in cyberspace or actually in any space to zero, and you shouldn't want to. But in many cases, it's a question of internal culture and somebody forgetting to update a program, strangely enough, to do an upgrade. It can be as simple as that. And so I think the question really to ask is from a regulatory point of view, how comfortable are we that these important service providers are being monitored and vetted with due diligence by individual banks instead of more efficiently with another kind of process? And how comfortable are we that we're not actually necessarily aware of who all these providers actually are? And so to me, a sensible first start would be to ask a group to try to map that. And I think Tobias kind of got to that point, but do a simple map of who these are, and I'm pretty sure we'll find there's a highly concentrated set of services.
Thank you, Caroline. Stefan, would you like to address all three questions?
Not so much the first one, but I'll give it a try when it comes to the second and maybe a bit the third. I mean, it's of course a very specific question, which is almost impossible to answer when it comes to exchange of information, because then one would really need to deal with these things at the national level and combine that with a conversation about the legal framework. Because what we tend to forget when we talk about cyber, this and that, we talk about these things as if it's only what's in computers that we're talking about. But keep in mind that financial products are a combination of technology and the legal framework. And with technology only, you don't have financial products. So you have to, so you're kind of back to what the legal framework looks like and what you have designed. But let me give you two examples of where this is important, and it comes back again and again and again nowadays. First is KYC, know your customer. And I would say today, if you don't know your customer, and if you happen to produce financial services, you're highly likely going to end up with a problem sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later, because that's essentially what you're expected to know something about. And that is important when you get into issues like correspondent banking and things like that, because then you need to understand between the players what is going on in the system. That, of course, raises the issue, is it enough to know your customer, and should you also know your customer's customer? And how far should you go? Not so easy to answer. Another similar type of issue that where different jurisdictions come to different conclusions. One is the example of whether a country should have or shouldn't have a national credit register, where the information is available or not available to everybody. And here different countries have come up with different conclusions over the years. So some of these questions are very, very hard to answer. And as always, when it comes to many things that we do, won't work without a legal framework, and the devil is always in the details. That's just the way things are. I'm not so sure that I fully followed, Pentti, your question. Was it about outsourcing and whether we're worried about that or not? I can give you a very sort of special angle to this, and this is, I'm talking now about this from the perspective of a small open economy with completely free capital flows. Now, in that environment, it becomes less and less meaningful to run everything within the national border. It's more and more likely that the fixed cost of operating these systems is such that you need to cooperate with others, because you need to have one computer instead of 10 or 15 or 20. But when you do that, then you end up having to fully understand what the risks are, whether there are differences in the legal frameworks and how these things actually work. And that's why I raised the issue earlier when I said that it's increasingly difficult to answer the question, where is my money? Because nowadays you can easily move information from one server hall in one country instantaneously to another server hall in another country. And here, clearly, the legal framework is lagging when it comes to defining what is it and how do you deal with that. But maybe I'm sort of a positive nature. So it doesn't worry me in the sense that you can't turn back time, so you better just try to do your best to deal with it.
Thank you. Jan, would you like to add?
Yeah, I agree with what Stefan has been saying. I wouldn't have a precise answer on the timing of the exchange of information. I must say it would be really dependent. But I just want to stress again, because you might find it curious that I didn't say anything about SWIFT until now, even if I'm the leading supervisor, that a thing like this information sharing center through which SWIFT informs its customers on real observed modi operandi of cyber attacks, it's really very important. It's very important. We have to share information. And it is in a certain sense creating a real community of CISOs of its member banks that will be able to I would say, to reach out in times of crisis. Then on the technology question of Penti, yeah, it's true that we are not front runners in terms of technology, central banks, in the adoption of technological innovations, I think. Yeah, I'm not referring to central bank digital currency, but it is very positive to see that the new technologies also start to find their way in the supervisory world itself, and even considered important enough to give them a separate name, RegTech. So that may be an avenue, interesting utilization of innovative technology for supervisory purposes may lie in the use of, for instance, deep machine learning, artificial intelligence to pick up early warning signals also in our job. That would be, let's say, a partial answer, perhaps, to your question.
Javier, you have the last word.
Okay, so, well, then maybe, as sake of summary, I will pick up on two of the points that Jan and Stefan just made. I think, yes, well, on the second point, the data, the information sharing, there are two very good examples of what they refer to. KYC, as far as SWIFT is concerned, we are innovating correspondent banking. I mean, and indeed, I mean, correspondent banking that has been known as being very solid, resilient, robust. There were some issues as well around the lack of predictability in time and cost. There was basically no information around when the payment was going to be delivered and how much it was going to cost. Now this is being handled with the evolution of SWIFT on correspondent banking, GPI, that provides a full transparency of the payment end-to-end, where the payment is, traceability of the payment in a tracker, and an information on the costs. But beyond that, so that's, if you want, is the innovation angle. But beyond that, I think KYC is very important. Is at the same time, we need to combine that with responsible innovation, making sure that that is done at the same time where the information around the whole ecosystem is available. So we have a KYC repository with information of essentially the whole correspondent banking market that can be accessible to improve the customer due diligence and so forth end-to-end. That's one. The other one, and Jan referred to it, is on cyber as well. This information sharing is critical. And earlier on, it was mentioned that competitors do not want necessarily to share their weaknesses or their issues in case of being hacked. It's true. That was the case up to probably 2 to 3 years ago. It is not the case now. We're seeing increasingly more a proactive sharing of weaknesses, attacks, malwares being experienced by institutions, forensics being shared with us, and that being shared back obviously in an aggregated manner, in a confidential manner, for the benefit of the community. And we are already seeing actually evidence of attacks, of anomalies being identified and attacks being stopped thanks to this collaboration. So yeah, it's taking. I mean, I will see also it in a positive, with a positive lens, the glass half full. We're seeing increasingly more collaboration and data sharing across the industry.
Thank you very much, Javier, for ending on that very heartening note, because the message which we received throughout is that what's very important is cooperation, collaboration, coordination, and information sharing. And I think the panel has provided many sturdy examples of how that is being accomplished. If I were to summarize this in just one line, when I came here, I felt like one of those turtles which Rob mentioned. I now feel a little less of a turtle, maybe more of a tortoise, but a lot more learned than before. So with that, may I request you all to give a hand to the panel for their remarks.